Hello and welcome to Upfront. I am Kang Tae-ri. The UN General Assembly voted in favor of a draft resolution that refers the North Korean regime to the International Criminal Court for human rights abuses earlier this month. This focus now goes to what the UN Security Council has to say about this. And here in South Korea, the North Korean Human Rights Act was proposed again in South Korea for the first time in 10 years. The ruling and opposition parties take different views on this bill. Against this backdrop, we discuss North Korea's human rights conditions and related developments on today's Upfront. And for this Upfront conversation, we're joined by Professor Yoo Ho-yeol from Korea University, a North Korea expert. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, nice to meet you.
And Joanna Hosaniak, Deputy Director General of Citizens Alliance for North Korean Human Rights, who has been working very hard to improve North Korean human rights conditions. Welcome to the program.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And of course, Mr. Ri Jung-soo, Co-President of the Sustainable Development of Global Network. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, as I said earlier, before we get to the business of the day, as I said earlier, this year saw an unprecedented level of momentum in terms of efforts to stop North Korea's human rights violations. What have we done so far, and what does it mean, and what's left to be done? Let's first get an overview in this next report.
On December 22nd, a new billboard went up in New York's Times Square. The billboard shows the picture of 꽃제비, a term that refers to North Korea's homeless children, along with the phrase, "Welcome the resolution on the human rights situation in North Korea," both in English and Korean. It also says that now is the right time for the UN Security Council to refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. This billboard was designed by 8 North Korean human rights organizations with the hope of garnering more support from the international community. Last week, a new resolution on North Korea's human rights conditions passed at the UN General Assembly. The resolution was passed with overwhelming support, and the UN Security Council adopted North Korea's human rights record as an official agenda item for the first time. Domestic politics have also responded to the international community's newfound interest in the North Korean human rights issue. The ruling Saenuri Party has urged passage of the North Korean Human Rights Act by the end of this year, while the opposition party has put more emphasis on promoting humanitarian aid to the north. Discussions over passing the North Korean Human Rights Act have been ongoing for 10 years. On this week's Upfront, we discuss why the ruling party wants the bill passed by the end of this year and delve into the arguments from the ruling and opposition parties.
All right, so let's kick things off in South Korea, the National Assembly. We are talking about the North Korean Human Rights Act at the National Assembly this month, and it is the first time this issue has been taken up in the National Assembly in nearly 10 years. What significance do we attach to this development? Maybe I'll start off with you.
Well, actually, since 2003 or 2005, when the U.S. Congress passed North Korean Human Rights Act, South Koreans also try to have that kind of law or act to prove or to improve human rights in North Korea. But as we had seen over the last 10 years, there is a great debate among conservative and progressive in and out of National Assembly. But this year, we had seen that the international community, particularly the United Nations, had passed very tough and strong act or resolution to improve human rights abuses in North Korea. And therefore, I think it gave us a great impact to have such kind of a movement. It's kind of a chance for us to have that kind of legal protection or legal encouragement and to kind of a safety net for human rights activists in South Korea to give a message or signal to North Korea?
As you mentioned, the bill was suggested in 2005. Why wasn't it registered back then or a few years later?
We had such kind of inter-Korean activities, and we have to maintain dialogue with North Korea. And if we have that kind of act, then North Korea might be embarrassed. And another thing is that a kind of priority problem. Some people are saying that it is important to improve human rights abuses in North Korea, but prior to that, we have to suggest such kind of humanitarian assistance to encourage North Korea to improve their own human rights. So I think there's kind of a big debate among us whether to put such kind of civil liberty act prior to the survival issue, or we should provide humanitarian assistance, and also we should continue or maintain a dialogue with North Korean counterpart or North Korean government or officials.
And you, coming from the academic world, you said this is a good development, given that it could give a legal encouragement to all of this conversation. Right. Your point of view, coming from a human rights activist point of view, what does this mean?
Well, you know, I think the South Korean Human Rights Act is important. I mean, North Korean Human Rights Act in South Korea is important in terms of symbolic gesture, in a sense that it is up to South Korea. It will be the burden of South Korea to resolve the issues with North Korea, including any human rights issues. This burden will fall upon us, upon our society. So it's better to prepare sooner rather than later to tackle that. Let's imagine that, for example, and one thing that I do believe as an activist is that South Korea should not always look to international community for action. North Korea is our fate. This is you know, divided country, but it should be one country. So we should take you know, the fate of this country into our hands, not always waiting for the action from the international community. That's why I think the act in that sense is important.
So both of you seem to agree that this is certainly meaningful. We need to go forward with this for different reasons. The legal encouragement, South Korea taking initiative. Now, then let's talk about what exactly this act entails. So what kind of legal force does it have?
We are now saying that we collected data or information and compiles all the data.
Right. Okay.
And if North Korean authority do not abide by our recommendation or resolution, then we put someone like the leader Kim Jong-un to the International Criminal Court. So that's very sensitive and delicate and very important message to North Korean society or system.
Just to play the devil's advocate here, without this act, is it impossible or difficult? Does it make things difficult for us to improve North Korea's human rights violations?
Probably not, but it would always depend on the political will. And that's the problem, that you always leave it to the hands of the developments on the Korean Peninsula, on the, you know, whether there is approach, whether there is engagement, or whether there is some threat measures being presented by North Korea. It's all, then human rights become hostage to the political atmosphere here and political atmosphere between South Korea and North Korea. It is necessary that South Korea conducts a stable policy, human rights policy toward North Korea, this regardless of which government is in power or what situation is entailing the Korean Peninsula.
We need to separate from the UN resolution versus the North Korean Human Rights Act
in South Korea.
One of the provision that probably you mentioned a little bit is we can elect example from West Germany, the Charles Gitt archive, where this archive recorded all the human rights crimes and also shootings done at the defectors, East German defectors, by the board guard. And so all those recordings were later on, and actually the offenders were processed in criminal court. And this is where that offering very severe psychological pressure on the North Korean leadership. So this is only one example, but there are many other provisions where they're supporting the North Korean defectors, plus also the private activity to support the improved North Korean human rights.
Because at this point, on-site investigations are almost impossible. Is that correct?
Yes, they are impossible. Of course, North Korea being afraid of being referred to or held accountable at the, for example, criminal court, International Criminal Court, started negotiations with the UN, with the European Union, and especially with the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea. But in fact, you know, this kind of investigations would not be really real investigations. I mean, how ad hoc access we can have in the country to the victims, how freely they are able to talk, what kind of access can we have really to political prison camps that North Korea denies of its existence. You know, there are certain limits, of course. Detailing of abuses is always very important, and in other countries, of course, this is one of the examples that Germany used, but also after reunification and after transition in other European countries, this issue was addressed by law in all of the countries. In many of countries, for example, in Poland, where I'm from, or other countries, there were very strong activists that they were underground and they were collecting that evidence of abuses. In North Korea, this is impossible. We have to do that outside.
The very real example is how the Commission of Inquiry, when they create their report, they use the statement from the defectors or those who are already victimized by human rights abuse as well. So they collected over 100 of the statement, and that was what became sort of evidence and also strong enough to persuade international community.
Right, right. So I want to talk about how bad the situation is in North Korea, and we'll probably have to spend hours talking about it just to talk about the conditions in North Korea. Then I want to talk about the current leadership, and how it did not or did make any changes to the North Korean human rights situations.
Well, I think human rights violation or abuses in North Korea is still severe. But I think because of this kind of international pressure, the North Korea is trying to improve some conditions. Well, because one of the violations is that they maintain at least 10 to 12 prison camps around the country in North Korea. But since this kind of violation has been revealed outside, then North Korea is trying to change or remodel as a prison camps. And that is and also they had some revision in their constitution and in their criminal law to make it much like similar to the civilized countries.
After the North Korean Human Rights Act was proposed at the National Assembly, North Korea has sent numerous statements of condemnation. After the resolution on North Korean human rights was passed at the UN General Assembly, North Korea declared that their previous agreement to denuclearize in 2005 was void. Ri Tong-il, North Korea's deputy ambassador to the UN, had taken charge of the North's diplomatic affairs. Some speculate Ri was removed because North Korea holds him responsible for not being able to stop a UN committee from adopting the human rights resolution. Also, there have been some reports that the North has partially dissolved or relocated its Yodok concentration camp. North Korea released 3 American detainees last month, which seems to be related to the pressure they've been under over their human rights issues. Cuba is moving to normalize its diplomatic relations with the U.S. after 53 years of isolation. North Korea seems to be in a difficult position amid rising pressure from the international community.
Like I mentioned earlier this month, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution on human rights abuses in North Korea. So why such a high level of attention and momentum on this issue now?
My organization has been going to Geneva for 10 years, so it hasn't happened, suddenly. It's been a slow build-up to that point. So there was first advocating for the resolution, then the resolution that would appoint a mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea, and then slowly reporting by the rapporteur with his comprehensive reports, and then resolutions every year that have been adopted at the Human Rights Council and General Assembly, with increasing number of votes of the states that were seeing that North Korea is doing nothing to improve its human rights situation, and that finally this lack of cooperation with the UN system convinced countries that there is no other way than address this issue through the commission, through the appointment of Commission of Inquiry, and of course the UN Commission of Inquiry did not discover anything unusual. Everything that is in their report was already in the previous reports from civil society, from North Koreans that escaped the country, from North Korean victims, and also in the reports of the Special Rapporteur. It was just the much more in-depth and comprehensive report, and then the Commission found that there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity have been conducted in North Korea. There was no other way than address this kind of findings by a very strong resolution. There will be a discussion at the Security Council, for the first time official discussion at the Security Council of the situation in North Korea. Hopefully that discussion will lead to the series of discussion at the Security Council, which down the road maybe will lead to some resolution that will call for a referral to ICC. It will not happen suddenly. It's a long-term strategy that you build, and it takes a lot of time to improve a situation in the country.
So the same situation in North Korea, the same stories in these reports, but what's different is that, like you both agreed, accountability element of this resolution. Do elaborate on that element.
Well, in the past 10 years, it is very difficult to change North Korean fundamentally. But this time, accountability, well, in case, well, it is not easy, well, it is too early to put North Korean leader into International Criminal Court. However, if we pass this kind of resolution, then North Korea is really worried about what happened to their top leader. The North Korean system is very unique, very strange. The leader is the everything. So this kind, we touch it, very critical point.
And Ms. Hosaniak just did the introduction for all of us here. And talking about North Korea's human rights abuses, I want to get another view from this expert in particular. Joining us is Michael Kirby, a former chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea. Mr. Kirby, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. First of all, what do you read into the UN General Assembly's adoption of a resolution on human rights abuses in North Korea? What meaning do you attach to it?
Serious abuses of human rights cause an instability. When you have such instability, there is a real risk of danger to the country itself, to its neighbours, and to the world. And I think this is why there is a growing appreciation that human rights in North Korea have a distinct security aspect.
And on the inter-Korean level, there are legislative actions to move the North Korean Human Rights Act along. Any word of advice on how Seoul should proceed with this in case of North Korea's negative reaction?
That's a matter for the democratic institutions of South Korea. It's not for a United Nations official or an ex-official to intrude on that matter. But it does appear from a study of history that the only language which North Korea really understands is firm language, which insists on basic principles. Any democratic rule of law country, such extremely serious crimes would be thoroughly and properly investigated by a prosecutor and by a court. And it's always a pleasure to speak with your station and to speak in that way to the people of the Republic of Korea. They are all related to the people of North Korea and are naturally very concerned about the situation of human rights on the whole peninsula.
All right, Mr. Kirby, thank you so much for your time and insights. Michael Kirby there, former chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea. So we are going to continue this conversation. I want to talk about the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula with the resolution at the UN passing the General Assembly level. Are we looking at more provocations from North Korea? What does this mean moving forward in 2015?
Well, I think North Korea reacted quite strongly against the resolution. And also, if we passed law, North Korean Human Rights Act in our National Assembly, then North Korea would react very strongly and negatively, and sometimes provocation will follow. But I think we should realize that even though North Korea reacted such kind of negatively, but I think it is a way for us to prepare for a genuine reconciliation between two sides. Because along with this kind of strong actions against North Korean human rights abuses, but we also engage in North Korea, as COI recommended, that we should engage in a peaceful ways, and we also continue to provide generous humanitarian assistance. So we should go in parallel or two-track approach to resolve all these kind of issues in North Korea.
There are people really believe that this is a very significant event, but yet when the people looking at what happened in the Syria situation, well, the UN made a resolution and they really did not make anything at all. So, do you think this resolution would contribute to improve real situation in North Korea?
Yeah, I think I expect the North Korean human rights will be improved, because when we had some kind of a survey or interview with North Korean defectors in South Korea, they didn't realize what human right is. Well, we explained in a real situation. Then they agreed that it is kind of a serious human rights violation or abuses when they stayed in North Korea. So I think we need to have some kind of learning approach.
So we're giving a lot of meaning to this resolution being passed at the UN General Assembly level. If it passes, I mean not passes, but if it's adopted as part of the agenda for the UN Security Council level, what does this mean? How influential does this is this going to become?
Well, I think if United Security Council passed, then I think it's a very,
well, let's not
kind
get
of
ahead of
revolutionary
ourselves.
changes.
But being part of the agenda itself.
Of course, we should continue to raise as a key issues in United Security Council. Then I think a kind of pressure, not just to the North Korean authority, but it's also kind of pressure to North Korea's allies or close friends like China and Russia, that they have to play a role to improve human rights in North Korea.
And having it at the UN Security Council, a regular discussion, for example, this is very symbolic because Security Council normally doesn't deal with human rights issues. Because right now, if it's at the Security Council level, there is a linkage between human rights and peace. And we know that many regimes that violate human rights are also a threat to peace. And then China or Russia might get tired with the threats that North Korea will, present to international community or to South Korea, threatening with the nuclear test or with the attack, that could lose support with many countries that are abstaining on the resolution right now, voting no, or those countries at the council that right now are protecting North Korea. At a certain point, they can say enough is enough. And I think North Korea right now, it's such a timing where North Korea has to think twice before it reacts.
I don't know about Russia, but when it comes to China, certainly there are so many China experts who are saying that Beijing is growing frustrated with Pyongyang and its behavior. So, and it has an image to project to the international community and global audience. And speaking of projecting a message or image to the global audience, North Korea recently released a couple of American detainees. People in the media read a lot into this. Did you read into this at all? Was it a message to Washington? Let's not go any further with the human rights momentum?
Well, I think it's a couple of complicated messages, not just to the United States, but to the international community. North Korea is a country which will follow the standard of international
we're not that bad.
Justice or whatever. And also they are trying to send a message to Obama administration that North Korea is ready to have a genuine or sincere dialogue with the U.S.
Okay.
In North Korea used two cars. One, North Korea sent Minister of Foreign Affairs to UN General Assembly. It was 15 years,
yes.
right? That minister would never went to the General Assembly. So it was the 15 years now. The second piece is that, particularly that North Korea approached the Washington to release these three hostages, and that's where that they wanted to show that if they're showing goodwill and how to delay or prevent to this whole resolution process, but it wasn't working out.
Yep, and we did mention this earlier on in the program, but legislation of human rights, North Korean Human Rights Act here in South Korea is certainly getting a lot of attention and discussion here in South Korea. And our team Upfront went out to get both sides of the National Assembly ruling and opposition parties on this legislation. Take a look. The North Korean Human Rights Act, proposed separately by the ruling and the opposition parties, was introduced at the National Assembly last month. It's been 10 years since the North Korean Human Rights Act was first tabled at the National Assembly. However, it has not been introduced at the National Assembly's plenary session for the last decade. This is the first time the bill was officially brought to the National Assembly's standing committee. Discussions on the bill have started, but the ruling and the opposition parties are at odds over the details. The ruling party suggested establishing a North Korean Human Rights Foundation and providing indirect support from the South Korean government. But the opposition party strongly opposes the idea suggested by the ruling party, saying that it's not right to give taxpayer money even for the organizations that fly leaflets into the north. The ruling party has stressed the need to record human rights violation cases in North Korea and make use of them as the basis of judicial decisions in the future. The opposition party wants to collect the information on human rights abuses in North Korea in order to improve North Korean human rights conditions.
The core of the ruling party's North Korean Human Rights Act is to record the cases of North Korean human rights abuses and establish an archive. Another thing is to secure financial resources by establishing a North Korean Human Rights Foundation. That's why we have supported domestic and overseas organizations and plan a variety of projects to improve North Korean human rights conditions. Another plan is to urge the government to investigate the North Korean human rights issue and report on it continuously.
We, the opposition party, would like to substantially promote North Korean human rights through the ideas we have suggested, because South Korea's legal system has no influence in the North. The right to live and the right of political freedom are both necessary elements for people's lives. But if we put too much emphasis on the political freedom, it can aggravate the North Korean human rights condition.
The legislation process of the North Korean Human Rights Act has been stalled for the last decade, and political parties in South Korea still remain divided. Would it be possible for the North Korean Human Rights Act to be finally legislated here in South Korea this time around? All right, so quite a divided view on this legislation in South Korea at the National Assembly. What do you think is at the core of the issue?
Well, both ruling and opposition parties are now getting cross of their differences. And because they realize the international community had passed a very strong resolution, and therefore both parties now realize it is time for us, South Koreans, do something to work for improving human rights in North Korea. However, the point is that the priority is still different between the two parties. The opposition party considered that we should provide more humanitarian assistance along with the, such kind of top resolution against violation in human rights in North Korea. However, the ruling party is trying to set up such kind of a legal and institutional kind of agencies to continue or to maintain such kind of pressure against North Korea by supporting some kind of activist in a stable, financially stable conditions. So I think both sides still disagree with whether we should establish or build a foundation affiliated to the Ministry of Unification. And the opposition party is still worried about that kind of foundation would support some extreme activist group who wanted to continue to send leaflet to North Korea. It's kind of a provocation.
Right.
And they could not maintain a dialogue with North Korea. So I think they should agree how to control the activist group in South Korea by giving or encourage them financially or legally.
And do you want to jump in here and give us your thoughts on this issue?
I think the act should not be a matter of forcing a view of only one side. You know, it should be if it has to reflect the society and if it has to reflect the view of the South Korean Assembly, it would be better if they came to compromise on both of these acts and of the differences, to narrow down the differences. You can hardly address certain issues, of course, in the legal manner, but in order to send a strong message, it would really need to have a bipartisan support. I think this is important, to have this real message being sent to North Korea. It would need support also of opposition party. The human rights are a universal value. It should not be attached to any political agenda. And a Ministry of Unification is a very specific case in South Korea because it has the duty to talk to North Korea.
Right,
this is a
dialogue.
Institution that conducts dialogue with North Korea. So it is sometimes very difficult, and also depending on the government here in power, the government here sets up certain agendas. I think that in terms of if we set up certain institutions, these institutions would rather be independent.
I'm going to put you two against each other. Aren't you a proponent? I read your recent column. You're a proponent of having unification ministry in charge of all this operation of this. Exactly. What do you say to that?
I think unification, Ministry of Unification is the kind of controlling tower. The minister should make a kind of plan how to improve human rights in North Korea. And they had to make some kind of details or action plans to improve human rights in North Korea. Then they had to work together with this kind of a dialogue and humanitarian assistance, and to provide some exchange and cooperation with North Korea. Well, actually, we considering the case in U.S. or China, there's no exact counterpart because South Korea is divided one.
Exactly. We have the Foreign Ministry and the Unification Ministry.
Yes, right.
So we will agree to disagree on that technicality of how to run this operation. But let's talk about the big picture. And I want to get your thoughts on what you think, what you want South Korean lawmakers to remember in pushing forward with this act. What should be the ultimate goal of this act? I mean, obviously to improve the human rights conditions in North Korea, but then a little more specifically.
Well, I think it's right that the Human Rights Act has some kind of symbolic or symbolic movement that South Korea people or government or politicians which was divided over these kind of critical issues, inter-Korean relations or North Korea policy. It is very critical issue in South Korea over the last 7 decades. However, if we pass this kind of act in National Assembly, I hope we could pass this by partisan ways. Then I think a kind of a consensus among us, and we could send our message to North Korea, not to driving wedge among us.
Any takeaway from the human rights, North Korean human rights acts in the U.S. and Japan? Any takeaway for South Korea?
The U.S. Act is very specific in terms of the drafts, South Korean drafts. They are rather more general, I would say. And also they provide for a certain budget to the ministries and to the personnel that will be involved, like, for example, North Korean human rights ambassador. But I think, you know, we would have to, there are no provisions, for example, that are in the U.S. Human Rights Act for what purposes this money can be used and cannot be used. This is not, for example, very specific. In terms of Japanese Act, Japanese Act is very narrow in terms of, as Japan only focuses on abduction issues, it mostly focuses on abduction issues. And I think this is something that would also could be included somehow in one of this draft. It is specifically mentioned in the opposition party act in the sense that the government should address issues of abductions and prisoners of war, as far as I remember. I think this kind of guidelines should be very specific in terms of that anytime the government, for example, conducts certain dialogue with North Korea, certain issues pertaining to human rights issues should be raised. You know, otherwise priorities, other agendas take over and human rights will never be raised. And these drafts are not that specific, and I think I have a problem with that they are too much general at some points.
Yeah, the similar, I mean, it's not the act in Korea, but according to U.S. North Korean Human Rights Act, the one of the importance is on the resettlement education. And so far, according to State Department, since 2004, North Korean Human Rights Act initiated, up until August this year, there were about 171 North Korean defectors have entered U.S. And they all receive financial support and the resettlement education certain time. And this whole process is the cooperation with the State Department and the Department of the Health and Welfare. And then it goes down to regional government. So as you said, there is very practical ways to support those defectors also to work with their psychological as well as the physical and the career development.
And also the Act pinpoints the role of China and criticizes really China in terms of their policy toward the North Korean refugees in China and their repatriation. So the amendment in the Act really in 2008 and 2012 really emphasized in the beginning that point. I think this is also very important, this emphasis on people, on helping people escaping the country. But also the Act, the US Act has several areas, for example, support for human rights, rule of law, democracy, development of the market, and promotion of access to information. And also certain budget is given to the entities that are doing this kind of work, whether NGOs or other entities that are doing this kind of work.
Okay, so what do you think we should include in the South Korean version?
In South Korea, well, we are trying to get some lessons from both U.S. and Japanese Human Rights Act. And then we already set up some kind of legal or financial institute like archives or some foundations. And also we are trying to make kind of a controlling tower. The Ministry of Unification is also the main officials to control this kind of legal and some kind of other activities. One thing that I would like to emphasize is that it is time for us to give some support who are decided to work to improve human rights in North Korea. In the past, we had still some kind of division among us who are accusing North Korean defectors. Even one South Korean National Assemblyman accused. So if we had this kind of an act, then we are officially saying that it is our duty to work for improving human rights in North Korea. Even though we are still agree not to engage or not to involve in a domestic situation in both sides, but from the perspective of human rights, we could recommend, we could play some roles to prove.
And we don't have that many days left of 2014, so do you think, well, that was the talk, passing this legislation by the end of this year. Is it possible, do you think? Are we too ambitious?
Well, I think I talked these issues with both parties, members or who were working for this particular issue. Then I think the situation is much better, but I couldn't guarantee that the law will pass by the end of this year. But I think definitely we have more hope or expectation that both parties are seriously considered to have Human Rights Act.
All right, so we've had quite a run for the past hour talking about North Korea's human rights issues, and not only that, the global and legal momentum to address the violations in North Korea. Now, I want to get your final thoughts, and maybe what can the South Korean government do in moving forward, in terms of moving forward in 2015, cooperating with international community, and like you said earlier on its own?
Well, I think it is important for us to set up some kind of standard and to maintain our approach, regardless of change of government. Well, we had some kind of, it's not a bad experience, but we had some kind of errors over the last 10 to 15 years on the issue of North Korea policy. So if we agreed, I hope we agree bipartisan on this particular issue, then we could continue to set up or continue to mobilize our support to help North Koreans to have a better situation. And also we could continue reconcile with North Korean counterpart, so in both ways. So I think that is more sophisticated way for us to improve our relations, by inter-Korean relations.
Okay, and Ms. Hosaniak?
I agree with Professor Yu. I think the problem here was that these human rights standards, which are universal values, are not really part of the South Korean policies or have been on and off, you know. So I think we have to have a stable policy where these human rights values will be included and the talk on specific issues will be included, whether this is dissembling the political prison camps, talking about the South Korean nationals that have been abducted and so on and so on. It just has to be a stable policy, and we have to learn that pressure never excludes engagement. I think is one thing that is being confused in many circles in South Korean society, that this is either or. It's never. There are also gray areas, you know, in between. The two can go together, and it's up to North Korea to learn that, you know, the standards, international standards, are different, and they have to change, and they have to change their methods. We have to somehow teach them. They don't have point of reference of how to change their ways. We have to set up example. There is no better side to kind of show them the example as South Korea, because we speak the same language and because we were part of the one country. So I think it is better for us to start to include the human rights dialogue with them whenever these discussions happen.
And Mr. Ju?
The Korean government has the philosophy of trust building process with North Korea. In order to implement that, what Korean government need to do is, well, as you mentioned, engagement, inclusive, and humanitarian assistance. We need to do all, and we are able to do that. And it's not that the zero sum, we take this out and we only get this in. We really wanted to see as holistic approach that make sure that the North Korean government feels that this is the international society community wanted to have the human rights. They survived in North Korea. South Korea is working with the international community. However, we really give the humanitarian aid as well as respect to North Korean, the residents, as well as the leadership.
Yes, there is certainly a momentum there, but a lot to be done from here on. And we do leave this conversation with some homework, I guess. Thank you so much for coming in today and sharing your thoughts with us. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, our viewers, for watching as well. Join us again next time. And until then, stay with Upfront on our website as well as Twitter. Our Twitter handle is 2014 Upfront. I will see you next time.